2 years ago we made a documentary on the occupation years in the Channel Islands, and that was a highly interesting experience for me, and it was also quite a traumatic one for some of the islanders who complained bitterly about the content of that, insofar as it trod on a few toes. They didn't like the way we talked about the resistance, didn't like the way we talked about the collaboration or the allegations of collaboration over there, and they didn't like the way we talked about the treatment of the Jews by the administrations in the islands. The occupation came about because the army, the Wehrmacht, were on the march and they were going to get to England. And as a stepping stone to England, they came to the Channel Islands. And they thought when they first arrived, of course, they'd only be there for a few weeks. Some of the German soldiers were in the shops there buying up tweed cloths, which they were going to have made up by the tailors in Oxford Street in London. And on that basis, people thought, oh, we'll be okay. We'll be all right. Dame of Sark, lovely Sybil Hathaway, of course, thought that they were, well, she thought they should be treated as guests, as honoured guests. And she detected that they were gentlemen when they arrived at the Seigneurie in Sark, when the Germans came up to say they were about to occupy the place. And she observed that they wiped their feet on the mat, and she thought this was an indication that they were really, really, truly gentlemen, and they were going to get on fine. And the MI5 boys, when they came across after the end of the war to conduct investigations into the way the island authorities had behaved towards the Germans, of course, immediately pointed to this fraternization, this collaboration, this cooperation with the Germans as being absolutely infradig. This is not the sort of thing you expected the exceptional British person to do. You know, invite the enemy around for dinner, lobster and fish suppers. Not at all. And that was also true in Guernsey, where Victor Carey was the bailiff, and he was castigated in no uncertain terms, castigated for inviting the Germans around to take wine with him down at his house. That was thought to be an act of gross betrayal of everything that Britishness stood for. And so what this book has to do with is exploring further that notion of collaboration which was abroad in the war years. It is true to say there were almost as many occupations as there were people in the islands. People had very, very different experiences of the occupation years. An old farmer living up in St. Juan would hardly see the Germans from one year's end to the other, whereas if somebody was living in St. Peter Port, for example, starving in St. Peter Port in 1944, you saw a lot of the Germans, and you were close up to what they did to people there. And your thinking about the Germans will be very much coloured by your experience of what they did to the Guernsey folk. As one of the Guernsey politicians said, they always had the gun. We were required to do nothing. We could do nothing but obey. Otherwise we'd be dead. Simple as that. There was resistance, of course, but it could only take a very limited form, given the proximity of the Germans, given the nature of the islands and so on. All those things conspired to prevent acts of resistance. And if there had been acts of resistance of the kind the Maquis carried out, bombing and killing the Germans, for example, then the civilian population would have suffered mortally for that. The Jewish question in the Channel Islands is probably one of the most difficult ones to address, because the emotions it arouses in the people who are still there from that time are very, very strong indeed. People are deeply hurt by accusations that they were anti-Semitic in some way, or that they were too anxious to do Himmler's work, that they were too much inclined to load the Jews onto the transports and so on. The defence, of course, is that we didn't know what was going to happen to them. We didn't know that they were going to be, exterminated or sent away or whatever. But there seems to be a lack of awareness that the Jews were a special case in the Nazi philosophy. They were there to be killed, and they were deserving, therefore, of the protection of the civil authorities. And you don't protect your Jewish minorities in circumstances like that by letting your bureaucracy carry out the work of the directives. I wanted to go back to those subjects and have a closer look at them in a book form, so we could look in more detail at some of those topics, those hot topics, if you like, that were brought up by the making of the documentary.